If you would just stand with me while we read the word and prepare our hearts for more worship. Matthew 18, verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them. And he said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than it is to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost."
Please stand as I continue in Matthew chapter 18. Jesus' words, as Joel started the passage, this is the completion of Matthew 18. Jesus says, "What do you think? If any man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go and search for the one that was straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst." Then Peter came and said to him, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, it was some time ago that when we were in the middle of the Corinthians passages in 2 Corinthians, that the Lord began to impress upon me the need to really understand forgiveness and relationships as we see the world around us fracturing, and as we see a church that's not sure what to do. How do we walk these days out? And I began to just find this in my spirit rising up more and more. And so I began to journey through the Gospels while I was doing that. And I began to see this Jesus who is teaching through parables and teaching his disciples as he was going and using examples. And I thought, wow, that sounds like modern day life. And in fact, about 85% plus times, Jesus used parables to convey the heart of God and who is God. Because when we see who God is, then we understand who we are. Who God is defines who we are, and then we begin to understand the world that we live in and how do we walk out the glory of God and the character of God through His church. And so I want to take a 3-part series to look at forgiveness, stories of forgiveness, and we'll actually have a very profound testimony about forgiveness broken up into 3 parts from a very special couple that actually goes to this church. And so I'm really looking forward to doing this. And so we'll look at the first part this week, then we'll look at the parable next week, and then we're going to look at the prodigal son on the final week. And I think these parables and these teachings have a lot to do with what we're going through now. And I think you'll find them extremely helpful and extremely hopeful for the future, for now and for the future. And so I've titled this Stories of Forgiveness. Jesus came and walked this earth and purchased our freedom and lives to show God's abundant heart of forgiveness. He desires relationships and goes out of His way to demonstrate His commitment. Jesus, God incarnate, chooses disciples who He is going to leave here on earth to show and live out this message for a fractured and lost world. God's story, which becomes ours, is one of redemption, reconciliation, and forgiveness with hope for today and the future. Hope for today and hope for the future. That's how profound this forgiveness that we have. And hopefully it just spills out of us and brings hope to those around us. And so Jesus is walking with His disciples and He is teaching them about the kingdom of heaven. It's a parable. He's going to use a child, and what is happening is as He is walking with them, He asks them a question because earlier on they've been arguing over who the greatest person is. Okay, they've seen Jesus heal, they've seen Jesus go to the Gentile, they've seen Jesus in the temple. Jesus has talked about how He's going to die, how He is going to raise from the dead, and all they can do is argue about who the greatest in the kingdom is. And they don't really even understand the kingdom. So they're arguing about something they really don't understand. And I think sometimes that's what we're doing. We don't understand the world that we live in because we've taken our eyes off of the King. And therefore we don't understand who we are. And so Jesus is doing that with the disciples. He's going to begin to help them understand who God is, which is essential as we walk through our life. So they're talking about who is the greatest. They're talking about position and hierarchy and value. And so I want to just show this on the screen. Jesus is going to make it personal, keep it personal. In fact, it talks about this. I found this quote. We don't know, it's from an unknown person, but it says humility, that grace that when you know you have it, you've lost it. You've lost it. So the disciples have just lost their bearings here completely, and Jesus comes in and anchors them in showing them what God values and how God values things for them. And that's important. And so when we read 18, I want to encourage you to be reading Mark 9. I want to encourage you to be reading Luke 9. Because what is going on is Jesus has just gone through the transfiguration, and He took Peter and James and John up there. So possibly they were arguing because why did those 3 get to go up and we didn't? Because Jesus told them not to talk about it, even amongst themselves. And so Jesus is very specific about that. And so if John, Peter, and James came down, they would have not talked about it. And that maybe possibly created some animosity. Maybe it was the fact that as they were out healing, they weren't able to cast out the demon. but Jesus was. And he says this comes out by prayer and fasting. Possibly it was when they ran into other people casting out demons and healing people, and they said, hey, stop them from doing that. And Jesus says, no, if they're casting out demons, they're for you. And it won't be long, they can't cast out demons and then blaspheme my name. And then before you know it, in Luke, they want to call down fire on people. And so here they are at this time arguing over who the greatest is. And I want to read for us Luke 9:46 through 48. It says, this gives us much more of a context. An argument started among them as to which one of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood him by his side and said to him, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is the least among all of you, this is the one who is great. And so Jesus is going to help them. Just because we're humble, it doesn't mean that we self-abase ourselves or we think we're not important. Avoiding extremes. So Moses in Exodus 3:11 actually said, no, this task's too great for me. I'm not going to do that. I can't do this. I can't do this. That would be a mistake. Moses thought too little of himself. And so that's not what Jesus is going to say through this parable and as he's sharing. And there's also another guy that I like, and his name is Elijah. And in 1 Kings 19:14, it says this, then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, tore down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And so that's another sign of almost like a false humility. I'm the only one left. Well, that's not true. Obadiah was left, and the 50 prophets that he hid was left. And he also wasn't alone because God was with him. And so this is important for us to follow here as they're arguing over who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And when we think about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, the thought there is there's a present reality of that. As Jesus comes down onto earth and he saves us, he secures our salvation, and people come to Christ, we become part of his kingdom. And that's a spiritual kingdom. It does have some physicality to it because God changes lives. Forgiveness changes lives. It changes families. It changes legacies. But there's also this idea of a future, that Jesus is going to have a literal, physical kingdom. And we read about that in Revelation in the 1,000-year reign. There is going to be a literal, physical kingdom, and Jesus Christ will be the only theocratic king over that because he's the only one that can keep peace and safety. That's the truth. And so that's our hope. That's our future. That is going to happen. And Jesus unfolds this for them and he says, okay, you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven? Let me talk to you about your mind and your heart and your actions. What is really going on? So I want to pull up this slide for us on what's really going on. And this is important to this context. And I think you'll find it helpful. I know I have. So Jesus comes. We put that in the heart because Jesus is God's heart for the nations. God's heart. He comes to earth to bring salvation to us, to bridge together, to bring forgiveness. Us. He becomes one of us, and we also become with him. And so that's that bridge to us. He became one of us, God incarnate. He took on flesh. He did that so that he could take our place. We become with him. And then you have on the higher part the breadth and the width and the depth. Jesus shows us the breadth, the width, and the depth of the heart of God for us. And part of the heart of God for us is forgiveness. We have forgiveness. We have peace with God. We have peace with God. There was no way to have peace with God, and Jesus Christ became our peace offering so that we could have peace with God, so that we could even be part of His kingdom. And then on the other side, as we put this in, there's a posture, there's an attitude, and there's an action. So this is important. Jesus had a posture as He came onto this earth. What was His posture? His posture was one of servanthood. Servanthood. He was a servant. He'll talk about this in this, that the greatest amongst you is a servant to give your life. His attitude was one of humility. In fact, Philippians talks about He emptied Himself. And then His action was He went to the cross. He did what He said He was going to do. He brought reconciliation and He brought forgiveness. And because we're His and we're His followers, we have an awesome opportunity to show the breadth, the width, and the depth of the heart of God. And we do that through a proper posture, attitude, and action. And the one that does that is called the greatest in the kingdom. And that's what He's going to work through here. He says, okay, you guys want to be great in the kingdom, then become like me. Then become like me. I can't be great in His kingdom unless I'm united with Christ. He's my master. He's my king. And so Jesus brings up and He says, and He called a child to Himself and set him before them and said, truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like a child, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus brings up a child to them. I am sure they were not expecting that. They were probably expecting him to say, well, Peter, James, John, you guys. They knew he was going to be leaving. They didn't fully understand, but they knew he was going to leave, and they're thinking of positions. They're like, I wonder what I'm going to rule and reign over. I wonder who I'm going to be in control of and over. I wonder how I'm going to do that. And He brings a child to him. Now, in that culture, it used to be a long, long time ago. You've probably heard this saying, children are meant to be seen and not heard, right? But in that culture, children were just almost unknown. They didn't contribute. They were just taken care of. They didn't have a voice. They didn't have responsibility. And they had very little value in the community until they got a certain age. And Jesus here is clearly picking up a child that's just barely older than an infant. A very young child, maybe 2 or 3. And I love how Mark says it. Mark actually says, and He took him up in His arms. And it literally, the thought is He hoisted him up on His shoulders. Because he that humbles himself, God exalts. And this little child is just this humble little child here that probably doesn't even know quite what's going on. And Jesus lifts him up to compare what that is like. This child that's humble, this child that's dependent, this child that clearly comes to Jesus and isn't intimidated of Him. And so He hoists up this child and He's going to compare something. And here's what He says, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Think about it. Unless you receive Jesus as childlikeness with your need, with your dependence, and with your humility, you don't even have a place in the kingdom. He says, unless you're converted, you don't even have a place, let alone great. You're not even going to enter the kingdom of heaven because it's impossible to receive the glory of the forgiveness and salvation and what we've been given without being childlike. Because we can't do it. And so we need to be like these children who are actually seen as weak and undervalued. And it's going to be really important as we work through the rest of this text to really get in that in our minds. And he puts out a few ways of how we can become like how we can receive a child. First of all, we become like a child and we receive them. And then there's 2 warnings. Don't cause them to stumble and don't despise them. Don't despise them. What were they doing on the road? They were despising each other because they were jockeying for position, number 1 position. And we do that. We can get caught in that trap as believers. We can mimic what's going on in the world. And so he says there are consequences for this. And so here's what he says. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. There's that link. There's that link together. If I've trusted in Jesus, I am in him and he is in me. We are one. And so how I treat someone who believes in his name is exactly a reflection of how I treat Jesus. That's absolutely vital. Because what did John say? They'll know you by how you love one another. Not how you agree with one another on secondary or third issues, but on them being a believer in Christ. Like these little children, God's saying, I value them. Why does he value us so much? Because he died for us. And then he says, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me, that's how we know he's drawing this connotation with believers. Believe in me to stumble. It would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the sea. Wow. The word there for stumble is the word we find for scandalize. It's the word, the meaning of the word is to scandalize. And the thought there is to trip somebody up or to set a trap for them that you know they're going to fall in. So think about the thought there. And I believe Jesus is using this word on purpose, especially when he talks about leaving the 99. Just imagine if in my life I cause a fellow believer to fall into a trap and into a pit on purpose. Because that's the thought here. He says, if you cause anyone who believes in me to stumble, to scandalize, to tear apart, it can actually mean to destroy, then it would be better for you to go ahead and hang a millstone and jump into the sea. And I remember being in the sea one time and we were 700 feet deep and I didn't want to jump off. But can you imagine, he's saying, it would be better for you to just go ahead and jump off and plunge all the way down to the bottom. That's the cost, and that's the glory of the forgiveness that Jesus Christ has paid for us. He cares about that so much that right out of the gate, he's going to share with his disciples and say, do not devalue this, because he died for us. And then he throws out these warnings. 3 warnings, 3 woes. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. So let's stop there. That what is taking place in our world today, Jesus talks about. It didn't catch him by surprise. There is literally a world that wants to scandalize each other. We're in a world that wants to destroy itself and wants to destroy anything that has to do with God. It is preying on the naive, which is why I think Jesus uses a child, because they can't protect themselves. It preys upon those that stray, meaning believers that stray. It preys upon that because it hates God. Who is behind this? The God of this age, little g, Satan, who blinds the hearts of the unbelievers so that they don't realize what they're doing. And so Jesus is preparing them for the future. When he goes, he's preparing them so that when things happen in their lives, like being thrown in prison or being flogged, or Paul standing before Nero, or things happening like oppression. You realize in the Roman world, they would take people and make them eunuchs without permission. They would change people in that way. That isn't a new thing. That is happening. Romans would come and tear families apart. There was marginalization happening. And there was going to be an incredible amount of lawlessness. And so Jesus is saying, woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. Now, there's some disagreement about what the man is, but I don't want to be that man. That's what I do know. Because Jesus says, if someone particularly has an agenda, and they are literally trying to put stumbling blocks on someone, vengeance is mine. And we have to leave room for that. We have to leave room that God will judge for that. God loves his people so much, and he went to such great lengths to show it, that if they're putting those stumbling blocks on, they are doing that to Jesus. Today, in this world, if there's a real agenda and someone's really doing that, doesn't matter what vehicle they're doing it to, if they're doing that, apart from them trusting in Jesus and falling on the mercy of God, they will be judged. They will be judged. And we can take solace in that in a couple senses. One, we can trust that God's in control and he doesn't forget. And he does protect his people. And he does care for his people. And second, we can do what Jesus said earlier in Matthew. We can pray for our enemies. And pray that they would turn. And as I've been reading this, I've been convicted. In fact, I was talking to a buddy at Panera this morning, and we started talking, and you start talking about things, and he's like, oh, did you see that debate? No, I saw the podcast stuff. No, and did you do this? No, and you could feel the energy getting up, and he goes, you know what? We need to be praying more. How much have we actually been praying? How much have you been praying? How much have we actually been praying and leaving room? Do we trust in the power of God? Because that's what he's going to talk about, the power of forgiveness. So there's real obstacles, real evil, real destruction. But here's what he says. Don't participate in it. Make sure you don't find yourself participating in it. How easy is it to insert ourselves and participate in it? And before we know it, we're in a spirit of anger. Before you know it, we've lost all sanity. And we just lose ourselves. And we lose sight of who we are. Put that slide up with Jesus in the heart real quickly. Do you not relate to that? I lose sight of this. The breadth, the width, and the depth of the heart of God. And I definitely get in the wrong posture and the attitude. And then my action just, and then people say, oh, Christians are just mad. Or angry. And we do that to each other, even in our disagreements. He's even talking about them. Before you know it, we're arguing. And here's what he says. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with one eye than two eyes and be cast into fiery hell. Does Jesus really want you to cut off or pluck out your eye? No, Jesus wants us to understand the severity of sin. The severity of sin. We think that sin is so personal. And it stays within its bounds. But sin spills over the shores. And it defiles people. And that's exactly what he's going to talk about here in Matthew. It just spills out. And everyone is watching. It just spills. And he said, no. This forgiveness costs so much that, you know what, if I'm going to be a stumbling block, I'm going to cut this arm off. I'm going to pluck these eyes out. God, have mercy on me. Help me, Lord. I don't want to be a stumbling block to anyone who believes in your name. I don't want to do that. Lord, help me. Help me. See to it that you don't despise one of these little ones. For I say that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Don't get tripped up on that. Hebrews 1:14 actually talks about angels being ministering spirits. They're here to serve us. God calls his angels to serve his people, to help them, to support us. And in fact, the angels are longing to look in and go, what is this forgiveness? Because they haven't needed forgiveness. They don't understand it, but they're to assist us. For the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost. And then Jesus moves into something that is important. Don't be stingy. I've titled, Don't Be Stingy with Love. And here's what he says. What do you think if any man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray? Does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go and search for the one that's straying? Now, I was thinking about this. I used to hunt out in Leavenworth. And there was an old farmer there. Oh, man, every time I went there, his wife baked me a pie, apple pie. She found out. And I used to hunt there, and he goes, Dean, you're the worst shot I've ever seen. I was horrible. But one day I showed up, and he was so worried. And I said, what's wrong? And he goes, I've lost one of my sheep. I've lost one of my sheep. And if that sheep gets in that water, he's doomed. And he had this river right in the back. And we searched for that sheep. We searched for that sheep. It was a young sheep. And we searched, and he called out, and he whistled, and he looked for him, and he looked for him. He left the other ones. He had like 600 sheep. And it was like he didn't even remember them. And he was looking, and I remember when he found that sheep. I thought he found $1 million. He reached down, he grabbed that sheep, and he put it right over him. This was like an 80-year-old man. And he carried the sheep back, and he cared for that sheep. And that's a beautiful example of what Jesus does for us. And he's asking us to do that for each other and for the lost. Have you ever talked with someone and they actually made you feel like $1 million? Like you're sitting in Panera and all of a sudden someone shows up. David Lee shows up. He does this wonderfully. In the middle of a crowd, and all of a sudden it's like I'm the only person in the room. David is focused on me. And that's Jesus. And that's what Jesus is saying. That's the intensity that he's saying. And why is that going to be important? That's going to be important because when we have to solve conflicts, we have to have that kind of posture. That kind of intensity, that kind of longing for reconciliation. I've got to find that sheep. I've got to find that sheep. I've got to find that sheep because our Savior came to seek and find the lost and the straying sheep. Don't be stingy. Don't be stingy, but give yourself to him. And then we come to the amazing and challenging next verses. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. I can imagine the disciples going, oh boy, he's dealing with us. Because they had been arguing, remember? You know there was friction. And what does he say? Well, don't be stingy, all the ingredients. Okay, if you bake a cake and you bake a chocolate cake, you don't leave out the flour and the chocolate, or you don't have a chocolate cake. And so Jesus is going to put out ingredients for us. It's not a suggestion. It's not a suggestion. It's our hope. And if we don't follow these, this is where we get into problems. And this is one of the reasons why people don't like to come to churches. It's one of them. It's one of them. It's one of many. There's a whole slew of reasons, but this has got to be one of them. This has caused more damage. And so the first thing Jesus says is keep it close. Keep it close. How often, when someone does something to us and we just fester up and we're like, oh, I got to tell someone that, we go to the wrong person. This isn't a time to text and say, do you know what this person did? Would you pray for me? This isn't a prayer meeting. This isn't a time for prayer meeting. Prayer meeting can become gossip meetings. They can. And this is not what we're called to. And please, when you keep it close and when you go to the person, don't email. Don't email. Don't text. Go to the person face to face, in private. It's very simple, but it's so hard to do. I can imagine Peter going, wait a minute, who sinned against who? Does it really matter? Go to the person. Go to the person in private. And here's some thoughts. Don't talk about someone, talk with someone. Believe the best about others. Believe the best about others. Believe there'll be reconciliation. Believe there'll be forgiveness. Go after it like that farmer went after that sheep. Explain, don't blame. Be real and specific, and want better days ahead. I mean, God went to such great lengths for us. And that's what he's talking about. You've won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, notice it didn't say he doesn't forgive you. It just says if he doesn't listen to you, it might take time. It might take time. We're such an instantaneous, make it happen, make it happen, make it happen. Leave room for God to work. Leave room for him to work. He's not on our timetable, we're on his. But if your brother hears you, then it's great. But if he doesn't listen to you, take one or two with you so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. Don't be stingy. Seek out wise counsel. Seek out wise counsel. May I say something about this? Impartial wise counsel. Maybe even impartial wise counsel that aren't privy on all the details. Because we're not called to make sides. We're called to win people. We're called to honor the Lord. And so Proverbs 18:17 says this. It's a wonderful little passage. The first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Right? I mean, I come in full blast and go, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. We may both be wrong. How many times have you talked with someone that has actually harmed you and you realize that maybe your attitude wasn't 100% good in it? And God does a work in your heart as well. He does a work in your heart as well. I had an old Bill Gibbs. Kirk knows Bill Gibbs, knew Bill Gibbs. He went to be with the Lord. But he shared this wonderful thing, and I'll never forget. It's stuck with me for a long time. Seek to understand and not be understood. Seek to understand. Seek to understand what's going on in that other person's heart. And if we're both doing that, God will be glorified. Don't be stingy, be winning. Be winning. And in fact, when Jesus talks about winning your brother, the passage that pulls up is 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 22, where Paul says, I became a slave so that I might win slaves. I became a Jew so that I might win Jews. I became under the law as not under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. I became as without the law, but not as without the law, not without being the law of God, but under the law of Christ. To the weak I became weak, that I have become all things to all men, so that I by my all means save some. We want to be reconcilers. Then he says this, don't be stingy, be in prayer. Truly I say to you, if he refuses, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now let's just pull back all our thoughts. Oh, we got to have a meeting. We got to have a membership meeting. We got to do this. Make pretend we didn't know any of that. What do we know of how Jesus treated tax collectors and Gentiles? What did he do? He loved them. He loved them. Let's lean into that. Let's lean into loving them. In fact, Matthew would be a tax collector, so he would have appreciated him saying that. Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if 2 or 3 agree on earth about anything they may ask, it shall be done for them who is my Father in heaven. In fact, when he uses that word you, if you go back to Matthew 16, when Jesus specifically talks to Peter and he says you, and he's singular there, he's plural here. Why is he plural here? Because this needs to be a normal practice within believers. This is for all of us. This isn't just leadership. He's saying you all. If we're part of the church, he's calling us to this practice. Forgiveness is calling us to this practice. Maybe because we haven't been generally as a church practicing this, that's why we have chaos. That's why we struggle. And that's why we don't appreciate the magnitude of the forgiveness of God in Christ Jesus. Because notice what he says. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth on anything they may ask, it shall be done for them, my Father who is in heaven. Don't be stingy with prayer. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am in their midst, keeping Jesus Christ as the center. And then Jesus says this. Then Peter goes, okay, Lord. Then Peter came and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? The common rabbi would pick 3 times. So Peter goes, I'll double it and add 1. That'll be great. And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. My goodness, 490 times was Jesus saying, hey, keep forgiving someone, but that 491th time, forget it. No, he wasn't saying that. He was showing the magnitude of what it was. He was expanding our hearts. We're going to show a testimony here, and I hope it expands our hearts in a story of forgiveness. I'm so excited. We are starting a series called Stories of Forgiveness. And I think the best story is to live and talk to people. And I have a couple here with me that has meant the world to me for so long. It means the world to Westbrook. And I just want to share their story and give them an opportunity to express how Jesus Christ can bring forgiveness to a relationship, to a life, and he's a personal God. And so we're going to just hit this right off out of the gate, and we're going to start talking about a story of forgiveness. Chuck and Kim.
Thanks, Dean.
Well, my first question is this. Would you describe your marriage before the chaos?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having us. We love to share our story. And so, our life before was we had very different backgrounds. And Chuck was the city guy, I was the farmer girl, and so right there was, the beginning of a very rocky road for us. Chuck's family were used to yelling at each other, and I had never heard my parents yell or have an argument. And so I thought the very first time that we had an argument, we were going to get a divorce. But that just was the way it started. And I was very selfish and very self-centered. And there was just much tension. We did not know how to be married.
And I, quite frankly, didn't know how to be a husband. I was angry because of my life prior to being married. My father was an alcoholic and very abusive, and as Kim mentioned, our backgrounds are very different. And my parents were not believers, so we didn't go to church and had no clue about anything about how to be a married couple or a husband or a wife.
Let's talk about what led to some marital problems.
This is strange, but I think it's appropriate to say to a lot of couples, newly married couples, is that there were financial issues that combined with low-paying jobs. We justified using credit cards because we both had jobs, and that was a mistake we also made. It was tough to getting out of that debt. We found out that we could not have children, and that was a big struggle as well. I traveled overnight, so I was out of town a lot, and quite frankly, did things when I was out of town that I probably should not have done. Didn't think it was hurting anybody, but it was, and I could justify all that. The other part of it is that we just really had a basic failure to communicate. And Kim felt intimidated in our marriage.
You separated for a time. Can you tell us how long were you separated and how did you feel about that?
6 months we were apart. And it was very lonely. I felt separated and just really was devastated and fearful. This was not the dream that I had in mind. And a lot of times that's a rude awakening.
And she's right, we were separated for 6 months. And the way that I felt was really interesting because I thought what I was doing was right in my own eyes, quite frankly. And yet I felt like a loser. I felt like a loser, and yet I selfishly justified it, whatever I was doing.
The separation must have been incredibly difficult. How did you cope with your separation?
Well, I love to answer this question because it was during this period that I met my Savior. And just briefly, I just want to say that it was kind of accidental, but at Hallmark Cards where I worked, over the lunch hour, I was walking down the hall, and here came these people out of this conference room with Bibles under their arms. Well, I had been in church all my life, but never heard the gospel. And these friends of mine who had Bibles under their arms said, "Why don't you come? We have a Bible study." So I was really curious, and so I went the next week that they met. I sat there and I heard these people talking about Jesus like they knew him personally. Well, I believed there was a God, but I didn't know he was this personal, the way they were talking about him. So it wasn't very long that I decided that that's what I wanted. And I just simply prayed and asked the Lord, I said, I want to know you like those people know you. And I feel like he reached down to heaven and just scooped me up in his arms. And I knew love for the first time, the depth of the love from Jesus. And so that was my starting point to cope with what was going on. And so all my needs were met in my Lord, my newfound Lord. He just caused me to forgive Chuck and to have compassion for him. And I would not change a thing about that time. I would do it all over again.
Well, one of the things that caused the separation, quite frankly, from my perspective, was that I couldn't understand this relationship, this personal relationship that Kim had with Jesus, someone that she couldn't see, and yet she could see me, and that she loved this Jesus more than I thought she loved me, and that was a real issue. During this separation, I felt like I was justified. Everything I did, I thought I was justified, and yet very unhappy and very lonesome. In 1984, my mother died at the age of 64, and I couldn't answer the questions about life after death, or even if there was life after death. I always thought that I could come up with answers if somebody asked me a question. I was very arrogant, and we were just days away from divorce.
Well, I'm just going to close out our service, but I want to close it out with this passage here that just shares with us why we're here. Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. If you need prayer today, please come and pray with us. If today you want to know how to trust in Jesus, we'd love for you to come and we'd love to share that. Other than that, go in peace and walk in the abundant forgiveness that we have in Jesus. Amen.